So, like I said, we are starting Unit 4 with, and that'll be like cell growth, division, all of that fun stuff. All right. So, before we get started, does anybody have any questions about anything so far? Just like housekeeping stuff? Nothing? All right. Double check. Hey, masks over noses, please. COVID's not fun. Did not enjoy. All right. So, goodness gracious, I already lost my page. Today, that's not what we're doing. Okay. So, cell growth, division, and reproduction. That is our goal for the day. We're going to hopefully, by the end of class, be able to talk about how cell size is limited, what limits cell size, why cells reproduce, and the different types of reproduction. So in order to talk about how cells reproduce, we must talk about why cells reproduce. And it all kind of boils down to size. Specifically, limits to cell size. So, all cells, bacteria cells, any type of cells in our body, our heart cells, our muscle cells, our skin cells, right? As cells grow, so cells will grow until they reach a certain size. And when they reach that size, they'll divide. So instead of us just being like one big heart cell, one big skin cell, one big liver cell, we've got a bunch of cells that do the same kind of function, because as cells get bigger, they eventually have to break down and divide. So there are a lot of difficulties cells face as they grow. So they're the reason behind why we don't have just one big heart cell, one big liver cell, one big skin cell. And we are going to talk specifically about two of them. So, difficulties as cell size increases. Number one is DNA overload. So, DNA, our genetic information, is all of the instructions for what we need. And we need to read that DNA in order to get what we need out of it. So, it would be like a library, right? Like if we couldn't look up information, if all of us went to the library right now, got the books that we needed, we should be fine. But if the entire school went to the library at the same time, there could be competition for what books we need, and we might not have enough books for everyone. So as a cell grows, information stored in DNA is used, but DNA doesn't grow. So DNA doesn't grow with the cell. So we have limited availability. Which limits growth. So if there's not enough information to keep a big cell going, the cell will divide. Each of them has their own set of DNA, and there won't be that information overload. Or, I guess, DNA demand overload, if it helps get things straight. So that's number one reason. We don't have enough instructions. If we had one set of blueprints and like 3 different architectural companies were using them, we might have some issues with getting that information where it needs to go. Number 2 comes with exchanging materials. So, cells, just like our bodies, we get good stuff in, we want bad stuff out, right? So, food, oxygen, water in, bad stuff out, wastes, etc. And those move through cell membranes. We've talked about cell membrane structure, how things move, active transport, passive transport, what can be brought in and out of the cell. So the rate at which materials can be exchanged, so how fast we can get stuff in and how fast we can get stuff out, depends on surface area. The rate of movement depends on surface area. Yeah. So the more surface area a cell has means the more cell membrane it has. And the more cell membrane it has means the faster that it can get the good stuff in and the bad stuff out. So we want as much surface area as possible based on the size of the cell. Which brings us to a very important point. So I put a little star by it, little exclamation points, little fireworks. And that is surface area to volume ratios. A little bit of math for your morning. Nothing too crazy. I think surface area to volume ratios and the idea of maximizing surface area to volume ratios is one of those things where I learned it in high school biology and I've applied it to a lot of other stuff in my life, and I'll kind of bring that on. But surface area to volume ratio comes up a lot, not just in cells, but cells are a good way to learn it. So, surface area to volume ratio. We want a high surface area to volume ratio. I'm gonna write surface area to volume ratio, surface area, and then our little colon is our ratio to volume. This is also surface area divided by volume. That's our surface area to volume ratio. Now, cells are spheres, but spheres is a lot of math, and I don't want to mess with circles and pi right now. So we're going to use cubes as our examples. So, in a cube, surface area is length times width times the number of sides. Our volume is length times width times height. Simple cube stuff. Nothing too crazy. So let's say we have 3 cubes. Three cubes. This cube has a width length height of 1 centimeter. This one is 2 centimeters. And this is 3 centimeters. And all sides are the same. Right? In that 1 centimeter cube, our surface area is length times width times height, which is 1 times 1 times 1. And that gives us 1 cubic, no, squared, sorry. 1 centimeter squared. That's our surface area. Our volume is 1 times 1 times 1. Or no. Ooh, sorry. Goodness gracious. COVID confusion still in my head. So, there are 6 sides to a cube. Goodness gracious. So, our surface area is 6. It's a little messy. Rewrite that. So, surface area 1 times 6 equals 6 centimeters squared. Volume 1 times 1 times 1 is 1 centimeter cubed. So our surface area to volume ratio is 6 to 1. That makes sense? I'll do it again with the next one. So, our next cube, our surface area is 2 times 2 times 6, 24. Our volume is 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. So our surface area to volume ratio is 24 over 8, or 3 to 1. So when everything doubled, when we went from 1 cubic centimeter to 2 cubic centimeters, or regular centimeters, our surface area to volume ratio went from 6 to 1 to 3 to 1. So our surface area to volume ratio went down. So when our volume increased, our surface area also increased, but not by as much. With our 3 by 3 by 3 cube, we've got 3 times 3 times 6 is 54. Our surface area, our volume is 3 times 3 times 3 gives us 27 centimeters squared, centimeters cubed. So our surface area to volume ratio is 54 over 27. Or, did not write that down right. 54 to 27. This means that as our volume increased, our surface area to volume ratio decreased. So as our surface area to volume ratio decreases, our efficiency decreases. So instead of having 3 big cubes, we would rather have, or 27 big cubes, I guess. We would rather have, I'm so sorry, my brain has not necessarily come back from COVID confusion. In this 3 by 3 by 3 cube, we can fit 27 of these 1 by 1 by 1 cubes. right? Because we've got 1 centimeter cubed and 27 centimeters cubed. We would rather have 27 little cubes than one big cube because we have more surface area with these little cubes. We want to increase our surface area because this cell has limited efficiency, meaning we don't have enough surface area to get what we need in and what we need out. Because increased surface area to volume ratios increase efficiency. Does that make sense as to why cells are limited by surface area to volume ratio? So that's why they need to divide. The next thing we're going to talk about is cell division. So cell division is kind of what we will talk about for the next 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. Before a cell gets too large, it will divide into 2 daughter cells. Before a cell gets too large, it will divide into 2 daughter cells. We say daughter just because it's easy to keep track of, and also they are technically descendants. So before a cell gets too large, it will divide into 2 daughter cells. So if one cell's too big, it'll split into 2. But before it does that, before division, it will duplicate its DNA. It will duplicate DNA, so each daughter gets an identical copy. So if a yeast cell splits into 2, those 2 yeast cells will have the exact same genetic information as that initial one. Division decreases volume. If I had a cake and I cut it in half, the amount of cake in each half will be smaller than the initial cake. So if we decrease the volume, this increases surface area to volume ratios. Because we are decreasing the number we are dividing by, because of surface area divided by volume. Now, for us, when we think about reproduction, we don't necessarily think about mitosis. But for a single-celled organism, when it does divide into 2, it is reproducing. A little bit more complicated with multi-celled organisms. But single-celled organisms, when they do divide, they are reproducing, because reproduction is the formation of new individuals. we can't talk about cell division without talking about reproduction. Now, we've talked about reproduction at the very, 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 very beginning of the year. I'm talking like one of the first, if not the first concept math we did. We talked about how every living thing, to be considered a living thing, has to reproduce. So there are two types of reproduction: sexual and asexual reproduction. We're going to start with asexual reproduction. So, with asexual reproduction, we are getting offspring that are genetically the same as their parent. So, genetically identical offspring from a single parent. So A as a prefix means without. So this is reproduction without sex. This is many single-celled organisms. Many single-celled organisms do this. It's how most of them reproduce. Not a lot of sexual reproduction happening between single-celled organisms, though it does happen. It is simple, efficient, and effective. It take a lot less time to get a second knee if I just rip my arm off and a new knee grew out. It would help get your project through. So, this can happen in multicelled organisms. It's not super common. It's mostly in plants. So this can happen through budding or plant propagation. I don't know if your TikTok feeds look anything like my TikTok feed, but there's a lot of people propagating plants. They'll go to a store, rip a leaf off of a cactus, and plant it and grow out a new plant. Or they will just see a plant on the side of the road, pick it up and propagate it, or grow it based off of a clipping. That is the same thing as asexual reproduction. That plant that you are growing out of that leaf from a plant that you took off a plant in the grocery store is the same plant. It is genetically identical to the plant that you took from the grocery store. So that's asexual reproduction. Moving on to sexual reproduction. This one's a little bit more complicated. We have offspring with genetic information from two parents. So this is how we came about biological mom, biological dad, baby, right? How animals, how a lot of plants, and some unicellular organisms get around. we've got this involves the fusion of two cells. So when it comes to people, egg, sperm, they fuse, zygote. That's going to become eventually its own organism. In plants, pollen, egg, meat, same thing. So, like I said, this is most plants and animals. Like I said, some plants can reproduce via asexual reproduction, and some single-celled organisms. So, we've got sexual and asexual reproduction. Some can do both. Yeast cells are a big example of that. Same thing with the yeasts that I did the fermentation thing with, right? In a normal environment, yeast cells will reproduce asexually. They'll just split into two and be done with it. But if they are under pressure, or if they know that the environment is not great for them, they will reproduce sexually in order to produce an organism that can survive in whatever environment they are currently in. So, I'm going to do a little chart. Love me a chart. With asexual reproduction up here. Ooh. And sexual reproduction. We're going to talk about advantages and disadvantages. A pros and cons lists, if you will. So, advantages to asexual reproduction. It is fast. It can happen in seconds. Right? You get one strep bacteria in the back of your throat. It reproduces, it reproduces, it reproduces. By the end of the day, you kind of get scratchy. Sexual reproduction is fast. This is really good if the environment is favorable. Really good in favorable environments. If a cell is perfectly adapted to its surroundings, if the surroundings are ideal, right, it's going to want its kids to have the exact same genetic information so the environment is ideal for them. Sexual reproduction is the opposite. We have something called genetic diversity. So even though me and my little brother and my little sister all share the same genetic basis, right? Our parents' DNA hasn't changed. We all have come from my biological mom and my biological dad. All three of us came from the same set of parents, but we all look completely different. We got a different kind of subsection of their DNA. That's genetic diversity, meaning even though we have the same parentage, we can have different biological outcomes. This is great in changing environments. So if we have a yeast cell that is really good in acidic environments, but really bad at hot environments, so it likes acidic and cold, and we have a yeast cell that is really good in basic environments, or actually, we'll say that is really bad in acidic environments, but really good in hot environments. If they are in an acidic and hot environment, right? They're both going to die because this one can't live in the hot and this one can't live in the acid. But if they have a kid, if they come together and they wind up with an offspring that's good in acidic environments and good in hot environments, this is favorable. That's why sexual reproduction is important for changing environments. That way, if this environment were to change and then it was all of a sudden basic and cold, well, they could also get a basic and cold offspring from this. So this one can have a sibling that got the bad in hot and the bad in acidic, and he could live in a completely different environment than his brother. Does that make sense? Why genetic diversity is important for changing environments? We'll talk a lot about genetic diversity when we talk about actual genetics. Okay, so our disadvantages. One last thing. Disadvantages. So asexual reproduction lacks genetic diversity. If this yeast cell that can survive in acidic but not hot environments reproduces asexually and has a kid that is genetically identical, that kid could not live in this environment because it can't stand the hot. Whereas sexual reproduction takes time. The process of finding a mate, actually mating, and then having the organism grow from that takes time. It's not as fast as asexual reproduction where you can just kind of divide. So, everybody doing okay? Anybody have any questions? So there's an exit ticket on Canvas. If you could fill that out for me, please. Nothing too crazy. I highly recommend you actually do this. I know a lot of people try not to do exit tickets, but I swear that those points add up. So tomorrow we'll talk about the cell cycle, and Wednesday we introduce mitosis. Other housekeeping things from yesterday. Make sure that you have the assignments from last week turned in. If you haven't, I highly recommend you take some time this week and knock those out. Also, if you weren't here yesterday or you are listening on the audio projects, I am not taking points off of for late work. So as long as you get your project in by the end of the semester, I will grade it. Remember that I can't get them on Canvas. You have to email them to me. And I have a couple no names. So if your project gets graded and you turn something in but didn't get points for it, just let me know. I can find